The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when four friends, Sam, Leo, Jess, and Maya, stepped out of their tents, ready to conquer Mount Katahdin. The air was crisp, biting at their noses, but the promise of adventure kept them warm. They had camped at the nearby Abol Campground, surrounded by the dense woods of Baxter State Park. It had been a year in the making, an all-out expedition to the terminus of the Appalachian Trail, one of the most challenging climbs in the Northeast. Sam, the most experienced of the group, took the lead. A seasoned hiker with a sharp eye for navigation, he had planned every detail of the trip meticulously. Leo, his younger brother, was the muscle of the group, eager, enthusiastic, and always up for a challenge. Jess, a self-proclaimed adrenaline junkie, thrived on pushing her limits, while Maya, the quiet thinker, had a fascination with the mysteries of nature. Together, they made the perfect team.
We need to be at the trailhead by 7 a.m.
Sam reminded the group as they packed up their gear.
The rangers are strict about not letting anyone up after that. We don't want to get stuck up there after dark.
As they hiked towards the trailhead, the sun rose higher, casting a golden hue over the vast expanse of forest. They crossed streams of crystal-clear water, passed through groves of towering pines, and finally arrived at the base of Katahdin, where the trail began to wind upwards.
This is it.
Leo said, a grin spreading across his face as he looked at the trail ahead of them.
The end of the Appalachian Trail.
Or the beginning, depending on how you look at it.
Maya added, her voice thoughtful. They began their ascent, the trail gradually becoming steeper and more rugged. The group fell into a comfortable rhythm, each lost in their own thoughts. Sam led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the path ahead. Leo followed closely behind, his energy infectious. Jess, always one to push the pace, kept urging them to go faster, while Maya trailed slightly, absorbing the beauty around her. The first few hours passed smoothly, the trail challenging but manageable. The scenery was breathtaking, with views that stretched for miles, displaying the endless wilderness of northern Maine. But as they climbed higher, the terrain began to change. The trees thinned out, and the path became more treacherous, littered with sharp rocks and narrow ledges. And then they reached the knife edge. The knife edge was a narrow, jagged ridge that connected Baxter Peak, the highest point on Katahdin, to Pomola Peak. It was just over a mile long, but it was the most feared part of the climb. On either side of the trail, the land dropped away sharply, leaving nothing but open air and a long fall to the rocky valley below.
Wow.
Leo whispered, staring at the path ahead.
This is intense.
Jess was already moving forward, unable to hold back her excitement.
This is what we came for. Let's do it.
Sam hesitated, his usual confidence wavering for just a moment. He had read about the knife edge, knew its dangers, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, sharpening his senses. Maya, usually quiet, spoke up.
We should be careful here. It's easy to get overconfident.
Sam nodded.
Stay close. Watch your footing. If anyone feels unsure, say so. We don't take any risks here.
They started across the knife edge, moving slowly, carefully. The wind picked up, tugging at their clothes and making the narrow path even more treacherous. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, the rocks sharp and unyielding. One misstep could send them tumbling down the mountainside. About halfway across, they reached a particularly narrow section where the path was no more than a few feet wide. Below, the mountain dropped away into a sheer abyss. Sam took a deep breath, steadying himself before stepping forward. The others followed, each step deliberate. They could feel the mountain's raw power, a reminder of how small and fragile they were in comparison. It was then that something unexpected happened. As Sam led the group across the narrow ridge, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye, a shadow moving across the rocks above them. It was large and fast, darting in and out of view. He stopped abruptly, causing Leo to bump into him.
What's wrong?
Leo asked, concern creeping into his voice.
Did you see that?
Sam pointed up towards the ridge above them.
See what?
Jess asked, looking around but seeing nothing out of the ordinary.
There's something up there.
Sam said, his voice low.
I don't know what it is, but it's moving fast.
Maya frowned, her eyes scanning the rocks above them.
An animal, maybe?
Could be.
Sam replied, but he didn't sound convinced. The shadow had moved too quickly, too deliberately. It didn't feel like an animal. They continued across the knife edge, but the mood had shifted. Sam kept glancing upwards, trying to catch another glimpse of the shadow, but it seemed to have disappeared. Then as they reached the final stretch of the ridge, it happened again. The shadow darted across the rocks above them, closer this time, and this time they all saw it.
What the hell is that?
Jess whispered, her voice tinged with fear. No one had an answer. The shadow moved too quickly for them to get a clear look, but there was something unnatural about it, something that sent a chill down their spines.
We need to keep moving.
Sam said, trying to sound calm.
We're almost at Baxter Peak.
But as they continued, the shadow seemed to follow them. It stayed just out of sight, always on the edge of their vision. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and with it, a sense of unease settled over the group. Finally, they reached Baxter Peak, the highest point on Mount Katahdin. The view was stunning, with the entire landscape spread out before them. But none of them could fully appreciate it. The shadow had shaken them, left them on edge.
What do you think it was?
Leo asked, his voice quiet. Sam shook his head.
I don't know. Maybe it was just our imagination. We're tired. The altitude, the stress.
Or maybe it wasn't.
Maya said softly, her eyes distant as she gazed back toward the knife edge. After a brief rest, they began their descent. The trail on this side of the mountain was less treacherous, but the sense of unease remained. The shadow, whatever it was, seemed to have vanished, but its presence lingered in their minds. They moved quickly, eager to get off the mountain before nightfall. The descent was steep, and the rocky terrain made it slow going. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, they picked up the pace, their earlier confidence replaced by a growing urgency to get down. But the mountain wasn't done with them yet. As they descended into a dense patch of trees, the path became less clear, and Sam had to stop several times to check their bearings. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the trail, creating an eerie atmosphere. The further they went, the more disoriented they became.
We should have reached the tree line by now.
Sam muttered, frustration creeping into his voice.
Are we lost?
Jess asked, a hint of panic in her voice.
No, we're not lost. We just need to stay focused.
Sam replied, but even he didn't sound convinced. As they pressed on, the air grew colder, the forest around them darker. The sense of being watched returned, stronger than before. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. They could hear movement in the trees, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush.
What is that?
Maya whispered, her voice trembling.
I don't know,
Sam replied, his eyes scanning the darkening forest.
but we need to keep moving. We can't stop here.
They quickened their pace, but the movement in the trees seemed to follow them. It stayed just out of sight, but always close, always watching. Then as they rounded a bend in the trail, they saw it. Standing in the middle of the path was a figure, tall and dark, its features obscured by the shadows. It was humanoid in shape, but there was something off about it, something that made their blood run cold. For a moment they froze, too shocked to move. Then, as if breaking a spell, Sam shouted,
Run!
They bolted, their legs carrying them down the steep trail as fast as they could manage. The figure behind them moved with an unnatural speed, gliding through the trees as if it belonged to the darkness. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the forest, mingling with the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs. Sam, leading the group, felt his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of the danger closing in on them. He glanced back, seeing the terror in the eyes of his friends. Maya, usually so composed, looked on the verge of panic. Jess, always fearless, now had fear written all over her face. Leo, the strongest of them all, was breathing heavily, pushing himself to the limit. But the figure was gaining on them. No matter how fast they ran, it seemed to close the distance effortlessly. The forest, once a place of beauty, had transformed into a maze of shadows and unseen dangers.
Faster!
Sam urged, though he knew they were already running at their limit. His mind raced, trying to think of a way out, a plan, anything that could save them. But the only thought that kept repeating was, survive. The trail split ahead, one path leading down into a ravine, the other continuing along the ridge. Sam didn't have time to think. He took the path along the ridge, hoping it would keep them out in the open, where they might have a better chance of evading the figure. But the ridge was narrow, with steep drops on either side. One wrong step could mean a deadly fall. The figure, however, seemed unaffected by the terrain, gliding effortlessly behind them. They reached a point where the ridge narrowed to a mere footpath, with a drop of several hundred feet on either side. Sam knew they couldn't outrun the figure here. They had to make a stand or find another way.
Over here!
Sam shouted, leading them to a small outcropping of rocks just off the path. It was a risky move. If the figure caught them there, they would have nowhere to run. But it was better than being caught out in the open. They huddled together, trying to catch their breath, their backs pressed against the cold stone. The figure slowed as it approached the narrow ridge, almost as if it was aware of the dangerous terrain. It moved cautiously now, its movements deliberate.
Stay quiet.
Sam whispered, though he knew the figure likely already knew where they were. They watched as the figure reached the narrowest part of the ridge, where it would have to move single file, with no room to maneuver. Sam's mind raced. They had a momentary advantage. The figure would be vulnerable here, but only for a split second.
What do we do?
Leo whispered, his voice shaky. Sam looked around, his mind working at a feverish pace. The outcropping they were on jutted out over the ravine below. If they could just create a distraction, something that would cause the figure to lose its balance.
Rocks!
Sam hissed.
We pushed the rocks.
The others looked at him, understanding dawning in their eyes. It was a desperate plan, but it was all they had. They began to quietly gather loose rocks, trying to avoid making too much noise. The figure was almost at the narrowest part of the ridge now, its movements slow, calculated. They didn't have much time. Sam nodded to the others, and together, they shoved the rocks over the edge. The sound of the falling stones echoed through the ravine, a loud, startling noise that shattered the stillness. The figure froze, momentarily startled. It swayed, its balance disrupted by the sudden noise and movement. But instead of tumbling off the ridge, the figure seemed to regain its balance with unnatural ease. It turned its head slowly towards them, and for the first time, they saw its eyes, glowing with an eerie light, full of malevolence.
Run!
Sam shouted again, knowing their plan had failed. They scrambled back onto the trail, racing down the ridge, the figure now moving faster, angrier, as if their attempt to thwart it had only fueled its determination. The ridge led them to a vast clearing, the forest opening up to reveal a deep chasm that cut through the mountain. A narrow wooden bridge spanned the chasm, old and rickety, swaying slightly in the wind.
We have to cross.
Sam said, his voice full of urgency.
It's our only chance.
The others hesitated for a moment, staring at the bridge. It looked barely strong enough to hold one person, let alone four. But the sound of the figure's approach left them no choice. Sam went first, testing the bridge with each step. The wood creaked under his weight, but it held. He moved quickly, motioning for the others to follow. Leo was next, his larger frame causing the bridge to sway more dangerously. He moved cautiously, trying not to look down at the abyss below. Jess followed, her usual confidence replaced by a look of intense concentration. The wind picked up, causing the bridge to sway even more. Maya was last, her fear evident in her eyes. She stepped onto the bridge, her movements slow, deliberate. But halfway across, the wood beneath her foot cracked, and she froze, a gasp escaping her lips.
Don't stop, Maya!
Sam shouted from the other side, but his voice was drowned out by the wind. The figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, its eyes locked on Maya. It moved towards the bridge, its presence sending a shiver down her spine.
Maya, you have to move.
Jess screamed, reaching out to her from the other side. But Maya couldn't move. The fear had paralyzed her, and the figure was getting closer, its eyes glowing brighter, its movements faster. The others watched in horror as the figure stepped onto the bridge, its weight causing the wood to groan under the strain. The bridge began to sway dangerously, and Maya finally snapped out of her fear-induced trance. She moved, but it was too late. The figure was upon her, its hand reaching out, almost touching her. In a last-ditch effort, Maya threw herself forward, landing hard on the other side of the bridge as the wood beneath her gave way. The bridge snapped, the old ropes fraying and breaking, sending the figure plummeting into the abyss below. The sound of the figure's scream echoed up from the chasm, a haunting, unnatural noise that sent chills down their spines. They watched as the bridge collapsed, the final remnants of the old wood disappearing into the darkness below. But the figure was gone, or so it seemed. They sat in silence for a long time, their breaths coming in ragged gasps, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. The wind howled through the clearing, a reminder of the danger they had just escaped.
We did it.
Leo finally said, his voice full of disbelief.
We actually did it.
Barely.
Sam replied, his voice shaky.
But we're not out of the woods yet. We need to get down this mountain.
Jess nodded, her eyes fixed on the spot where the bridge had been.
That thing, whatever it was, it's gone, right?
Sam wanted to reassure her, but the truth was, he didn't know. The figure had fallen into the abyss, but its unnatural movements, its glowing eyes, it wasn't something that could be easily explained away.
We need to keep moving.
Sam said finally.
Let's get back to the trail.
They stood up, their bodies aching, their minds exhausted, but they knew they couldn't stay there. They began to make their way down the mountain, the trail becoming more familiar, more recognizable as they descended. But as they walked, the sense of unease returned. The wind seemed to carry whispers, the shadows in the trees seemed to move with them, and always there was the feeling of being watched, of something following them just out of sight. They finally reached the tree line, the end of the trail in sight. Relief washed over them, but it was tempered by the lingering fear of what they had encountered on the mountain. As they approached the trailhead, they saw the familiar sight of the ranger station, a beacon of safety in the wilderness. But something was wrong. The station was empty. The door was open, swinging in the wind, but there was no sign of the rangers who should have been there, no sign of any other hikers.
Where is everyone?
Leo asked, his voice full of confusion. Sam walked up to the station, pushing the door open fully. The inside was a mess, papers scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, and the radio silent.
They were here.
Sam said, his voice low.
Something happened.
Jess walked over to the window, looking out at the forest.
Do you think it got them too?
Maya, still shaken from her near fall, sat down on one of the overturned chairs, her mind racing.
What if it's not gone? What if it's still out there?
Sam didn't have an answer. The figure, the shadow, it had been unlike anything they had ever encountered before. And the mountain, once a place of adventure and challenge, now felt like something far more sinister.
We need to leave.
Sam said finally.
We need to get out of here and find help.
But as they turned to leave, they heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching the station. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside the door. And then they stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. They stared at the door, waiting, but nothing happened. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Sam stepped forward, his hand reaching for the doorknob. He hesitated, his mind racing with the possibilities of what could be on the other side.
What do we do?
Jess whispered, her voice barely audible. Sam looked back at his friends, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. He knew they couldn't stay there, but opening that door felt like the most terrifying thing in the world. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening on the doorknob. And then, the door swung open on its own. It creaked an unnerving break in the silence, revealing the empty forest beyond. The footsteps, the figure, it was all gone, leaving only the eerie silence in its wake. They stood there for a moment, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. The figure, the shadow, the empty ranger station, it all felt like a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. But this was real. The mountain, the danger, it was all too real.
We have to leave.
Sam said finally, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides.
We need to get out of here.
They gathered their things, their movements quick and efficient, driven by the need to escape the mountain that had turned on them. They stepped out of the ranger station, their eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the figure, the shadow that had haunted them. But the forest was still, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. The path back to the parking lot was clear, and they began to move quickly, their footsteps almost silent on the dirt trail. As they walked, the sense of being watched grew stronger, but they didn't dare look back. They focused on the path ahead, on the safety that lay just beyond the trees. But the mountain wasn't done with them yet. As they neared the parking lot, they heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was low, almost inaudible, but it sent a shiver down their spines. They stopped, listening, their eyes wide with fear. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, until it was clear it was saying something, a single word repeated over and over.
Stay.
They froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The word echoed through the forest, seeming to come from all directions, wrapping around them like a cold embrace.
What do we do?
Jess whispered, her voice trembling. Sam looked around, his mind racing. The parking lot was just ahead, the end of the trail, the promise of safety. But the mountain, the shadow, the whisper, it was all too much, too strange. Then the whisper changed. It became more insistent, more desperate, as if pleading with them.
Stay or die.
A cold chill ran down their spines. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a threat. Sam knew they couldn't stay, but the fear of what might happen if they left paralyzed him. The others looked at him, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror.
We have to leave.
Sam said again, more forcefully this time.
We can't stay here. We have to go now.
They started moving again, faster this time, their feet pounding against the dirt trail. But the whisper followed them, growing louder, more menacing.
Stay or die.
The parking lot was in sight now, just a few yards away. But as they approached, they saw something that made them stop dead in their tracks. The cars were gone, all of them. The parking lot, which had been full when they arrived, was now empty, except for a single old rusted car that looked like it had been there for decades.
What the hell?
Leo muttered, his voice barely above a whisper.
There were other cars here.
Jess said, her voice shaking.
We're not alone up here.
Sam's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The mountain, the shadow, the whisper, it was all connected somehow, but he couldn't piece it together.
We need to find another way down.
Sam said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at his insides.
There's got to be another trail.
But as they turned to leave, they heard it again, the sound of footsteps. But this time, it was coming from the direction they had just come. They turned, their eyes wide with terror, and saw it, the figure standing at the edge of the forest, watching them. But it wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the trees, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light, their movements slow, deliberate. They formed a line, blocking the path back up the mountain. They were surrounded. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing. There was no way out, and they were trapped. Then one of the figures stepped forward, its eyes locking onto Sam's. It raised a hand, pointing directly at him.
Stay or die.
Sam knew in that moment that they had no choice. The mountain, the figures, they wouldn't let them leave. The only way to survive was to stay, to face whatever dark secrets the mountain held. He turned to his friends, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. But instead of running, Sam felt something shift inside him. The fear that had gripped him so tightly began to loosen. They had been running all this time, running from something they didn't understand, something that might not even be real. What if it's all in our heads, he thought. He looked back at the shadowy figure, then to his friends.
What if we stop running?
What do you mean?
Jess asked, her voice trembling. Sam took a deep breath.
We've been running, and it's only been getting worse. What if we turn around and face it? What if we stand our ground?
Leo looked terrified at the suggestion, but Maya, despite her earlier fear, seemed to understand.
Face it?
She echoed.
You think that will stop it?
Sam nodded slowly.
Maybe it's been feeding on our fear. Maybe the real challenge is standing up to it.
There was a long, tense silence. Then together they turned to face the shadows. Sam stepped forward, his friends close behind, their fear giving way to a determined resolve. The shadowy figures stood motionless, their glowing eyes fixed on the group. The whispering wind fell silent, the entire forest seeming to hold its breath. Sam locked eyes with the figure that had led the others. He squared his shoulders, refusing to back down.
We're not afraid of you.
He said, his voice steady.
We're not running anymore.
For a moment, nothing happened. The shadows loomed closer, their forms shifting and swirling as if unsure of what to do next. Then slowly, the figures began to fade, their outlines growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. The oppressive weight of fear lifted, and the night returned to its normal stillness. The mountain, once a place of terror, seemed calm, almost serene. Sam and his friends stood in silence, the realization washing over them. The threat had vanished, not because they had escaped it, but because they had faced it head-on. The shadow had no more interest. It thrived on fear, and without it, it was powerless. Maya let out a long breath, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth.
We did it.
She said quietly.
We faced it. And it's gone.
Sam nodded, a sense of calm settling over him.
Sometimes courage alone is enough to banish our fears.
With the path now clear, they made their way down the mountain, the tension easing with each step. The lesson was learned. Fear is only as powerful as the strength you give it, and when you confront it head-on, it often fades away, revealing itself as nothing more than a shadow. And so they left the mountain behind, not as victims of its terror, but as victors over their own fears, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.